That drive home is when I asked my mom and dad if I was going to die. My name is Matthew. I am 23 years old, and my story doesn't start until 2012 when I was 8 years old in the third grade. Back then, I was a pretty normal kid. I liked going outside and going hiking, swimming, camping, and spending time with my siblings. However, around this time is when all of that started to change. In the summer before fourth grade is when I started to feel a little bit more tired and weaker than usual. I would have to start taking longer breaks and I would have to sit down more often, especially during physical activities. My mom and dad would even notice that I was sleeping more and becoming more irritable of them and others around me. At the time, it just kind of seemed like normal kid behavior. You know, maybe I was trying to get out of chores or maybe I was going through a phase. For example, this is me and my mom on March 24th, 2012. Looking at the photo, there really weren't any obvious signs that something was going on other than the fatigue I had been feeling behind the scenes. In the months after that photo had been taken is when things started to go downhill. The fatigue I had already been feeling became much more intense, and it got to the point where simple things like walking a short distance became difficult. I would have to stop and bend over, put my hands down on my knees just to catch my breath. Even sitting in a chair was a challenge. I couldn't really keep myself upright. I was always wobbly and I would always feel too tired to even just sit up with a good posture. And I would have to put my legs up in my chair just to feel stable. As time went on, it got to the point where just walking around and putting my hands down on my knees to catch my breath wasn't really working anymore. I started to feel too fatigued to even stand up for that long, so I would have to go down onto the ground and either sit down or even lay on the ground. And sometimes I would have to crawl to my destination because my legs were too weak that I couldn't get back up. I had also lost a pretty significant amount of weight at this point, which was weird because my diet didn't really change. I was still eating properly, and it got to the point where I lost so much weight that you could see basically all of my ribs, my entire spinal column, and all of the bony projections like your shoulders and your hips. And this is also the around the time where I started to develop a pretty dark bronze tan, which is also odd because I wasn't going outside and I shouldn't have had a tan. At home, all I could really do is lie down or sleep, and there was no doing any physical activity like going outside anymore because anytime I tried, I would just feel incredibly sick. And, you know, it got to the point where my heart would just pound and pound until it would feel like it would just burst out of my chest. I started to also get a pretty significant amount of pain. My body would just ache all the time and my stomach would hurt, like cramps all the time. And it would get to the point where I would just lay in a fetal position and cry. I would even wake up in the middle of the night or out of my naps because of how much pain I was in. With everything going on, I was going to school. I had started the fourth grade and I wasn't there all the time just because of how sick I was, but the days I was at school, it really didn't help. During school, I couldn't really do much. I couldn't participate in recess and I couldn't participate in PE because of just how weak I was. And even schoolwork was pretty tough because I just had brain fog all the time and I couldn't really focus on anything. I can remember a day on, I think, Veterans Day week, our school had a play and our class was up, and of course I was up on the stage, and at this point I really couldn't stand for very long, and I remember feeling dizzy and getting lightheaded, and I passed out on the stage in front of everybody. And the last thing I remember was waking up in the nurse's station. I do want to point out that throughout all of this, of course, my parents knew something was going on. I had doctor's appointments, you know, back after back, and they were trying their hardest to figure out what was going on. But most of these doctor's visits weren't giving us any answers. Most of the time the doctors would just say it's because of anxiety, it's because of me being underweight and I needed to eat more, or I had asthma. You know, unfortunately, none of these doctor's visits gave us any understanding of what was going on. During one of those visits, I did get referred to a doctor at a children's hospital. And this is when things started to get pretty serious. The first thing that Children's Hospital wanted to chase was the possibility that I had leukemia, which I had some of the signs, some of the symptoms, and characteristics of a child having leukemia. However, that was quickly debunked with some tests. So they went on to the next test, which was a sweat test. So they had put a patch on my skin where it collected my sweat, and from that sweat, they'd be able to test how much salt my body was releasing. And my body was releasing an abnormally high amount of salt, which led the doctors to believe that I had cystic fibrosis. With that in mind, they then wanted to do a respiratory and cardiac stress test. So they put a bunch of stickers on me and hooked me up to the EKG machine, and then they fitted me with a respiratory mask, and the plan was to sit me in front of a treadmill and for me to get up, get on the treadmill and walk so that they could, you know, see my vitals. However, I couldn't even start the test because every time I tried to get up, I would collapse back down. I couldn't even stand up out of the chair by myself without collapsing right back down. After that, they had admitted me to the children's hospital, where I would be staying either until they figured out what was going on or worse. And that drive home is when I asked my mom and dad if I was going to die. I was in the 4th grade, asking my parents if I was going to die. When we arrived back at the hospital to get admitted in, I couldn't walk at this point. From the car all the way to the check-in office, I was carried in by my mom. And then when I was checked in, I had been put in a wheelchair, and then they took me to my room. I can remember going into the room for the first time. There was a pretty big window, and of course there was the hospital bed in the middle. And in front of that was a Xbox 360 and a TV. And I think I remember playing Lego Harry Potter and maybe a Madagascar game on that, if I'm not wrong. But to the left of the hospital bed was a little computer, which I think it had like the TV remotes on it and everything. But the important thing about that was they had a digital menu that was hooked up to the cafeteria, and I was able to order as much food as I wanted whenever I wanted. Because I had lost so much weight at that point, they had to get it up as fast as possible. And they would even put like carbohydrate powder in all my food to just give me extra calories. During my stay, there was a pretty constant flow of doctors and nurses, student doctors that would come in. Each of them had a different specialty, and all of them were chasing a different theory. However, the one theory that we heard the most from was cystic fibrosis. The confusing part about cystic fibrosis was that some of the tests that they had done after I had gotten admitted didn't really add up. They had done a lung scan, which was clear, and they also did a genetic test on me and my mom, which showed that I didn't have any of the genes for cystic fibrosis, which means I shouldn't really have had cystic fibrosis, but the doctors were convinced enough that they were trying to diagnose me with it. Then came a student doctor who was doing his residencies at the time with a endocrinologist on my case, and he started to suspect something else entirely. He started to suspect Addison's disease. He had remembered a small little segment in med school about a disease called Addison's disease, and from my chronic fatigue, my weight loss, and especially the bronzing of my skin, everything just seemed to add up. So he ended up talking to my endocrinologist about that, and they ordered a 21 hydroxylase antibody blood test, which within a normal, I shouldn't say normal, but healthy individual, that test should come back as less than 1 unit per milliliter. And when my test came back, it was 454.8 units per milliliter, which they stated as very, very positive. Of course, after that, the endocrinologist came down to my room, and the first thing that he had said to all of us was, "We've got it." Then he explained what Addison's disease was, and then from that moment on, that we were going to become experts in something not a lot of people know about. As he was explaining what Addison's disease was and how it would affect my daily life, he had ordered some Solu-Cortef, which is liquid hydrocortisone, and he looked at my parents and told them to watch me closely because my behavior was about to change almost instantaneously. And he was right. I was able to sit up on my own out of my bed and even stand up and walk around my room by myself, which of course it wasn't like miraculous. I was walking all around running, but I was walking without having to take any rest. It had felt like the first time in forever, like a whole bunch of weights had lifted off of me. There was some time before then and getting discharged that I had to kind of recover my physical strength back, and I had to gain a little bit of weight for them to discharge me. But by then, it felt like everything had changed for me. It felt like I was in a new body. And the same doors that I was carried into by my mom, I had walked out, even wheeling my suitcase behind me. So that was my story on how I was diagnosed with primary Addison's disease. I hope you guys enjoyed watching, and have a good day.